Hello and welcome to week 3's feedback video. I just want to apologize for it taking me a little longer than I had hoped this week. I had not anticipated on attending this conference, but the assistant dean stopped by my office and all of a sudden I'm in Nashville for 3 days and with a variety of obligations. So I just did not anticipate that happening, and I just want to apologize to you. I'm going to Philadelphia this coming week, so I'm going to do my best to grade everything before I leave. I just appreciate your patience on the grading this week, and I'm going to try to get back on track. So thank you. So here's the feedback video, and I understand if this is a little too late to make any kind of substantial changes for Monday. I completely understand that. Just a few things to keep in mind. I'd like to go over the team's work so that we can learn from that. I gave you a few pointers via email. I'll review those quickly, and then I'd also like to talk about a few of the discussion points that were brought up in our discussion boards, and I think that's all. So first I'd like to take a look at Team 1's work. Here we see, I'm just going to highlight stage 3s. I'm not going to go back to stage 1 and 2s for this video. But in stage 3, this is, I think this is one of the issues that a lot of people will have with their individual units. So I really want to highlight this. If you think about, and this is something I put in the email, if you think about what you are actually going to be able to cover in depth, you probably won't be able to cover 5 different essential questions and enduring understandings. So don't be afraid to really focus on something. I find that if you are trying to cover too many things, you don't cover anything well. So that's one thing to be aware of. Although I do appreciate how they've really aligned their essential questions and enduring understandings to their framework and to their lessons, and so that is something I'm definitely looking for. I apologize for these tables also. I know that they're a little bit cumbersome in what I'm asking you to do, but I do think they give you a good overview of what's coming. They did a great job explaining the different learning experiences that they're going to be using, and a lot of them were higher level thinking, such as they had Socratic seminars, self-reflective rubrics, use of technology. All those pieces were embedded there. The one suggestion that I would have is if you're going to do a lesson, well, of course, everyone's going to do a lesson, but when you do a lesson, I would really consider how you are differentiating it and making sure that you have enough details in your lesson that I could come into your classroom and implement the lesson. So they did a really neat idea. They did a web quest, and really, I would say they did a web research project. But here is, they have a site that they used called Padlet, which is like the site I recommended, I think, last week on Squirrel, and it's a very similar type of site. Their site, Padlet, is really cool, so I wanted to highlight that really quickly for you. So here's a part of Padlet. This is the site that Team 1 created, and you can just click here and it will take you and load, it will take you to the website that, or the PDF. Here's the website I just clicked on. It'll take you to the website that they've linked. Here's their explanation of science fiction because they're reading a science fiction book. And so I've seen this done really well. Some of my undergrads love Padlet, so I thought I would highlight Team 1's work in this area. So that was a great idea. Thank you for sharing that. And then they tiered it, so for their on-level students, they tiered it by giving them all the resources they needed on that Padlet site. And then for their above-level students, they allowed it to be very open-ended and allowed the students to find and evaluate their own websites. So that's an example of a process tier where you're expecting different processes to go into this assignment. Okay, so moving on to Team 2, they also did a great job filling out the chart, thinking through their objectives, their enduring understandings, and essential questions. And one thing that I started thinking about, and this just tells you a little bit about the flexibility of this chart, but I was thinking it might even be too much to have both an enduring understanding and an essential question for every lesson. If you find that that is the case and that you feel like you can't address it fully, you can go ahead and use either an enduring understanding or an essential question, because I think it's almost better to err on the side of um, too few big ideas than too many big ideas. I think you just, if it's truly a big idea, then you want time to explore it and you want time to think about it. And if you have too many, I don't think the students will be able to remember and keep referring back to the big ideas, which I think is very important. That's not the same as not having enough activities. I read in the discussion board this week, some of you are over planners, which I think is great. I just think there is actually a difference between being an over planner and being, I don't even know if this is a word, an over objective, or someone who has way too many objectives. I think it's better to have fewer objectives and then more learning experiences to meet those objectives than having more objectives. I would err on the side of less objectives and err on the side of more experiences. So that you can take that for what it's worth. But I do think being very clear about what you want them to know and having fewer big ideas will result in better and more thorough discussions. And they did a really nice job talking a little bit about how to analyze data, and which I thought was interesting because they're really connecting the data component in with their science unit on biodiversity. So that was really neat. And then here's their lesson. They had an organism sort, they had a journal, they had some really great questions, some prediction level questions, like predict what would happen if this were to happen, and that's really going to encourage their students to be critical thinkers. And then here they had different topic cards, and this is something I think that we can all learn from also, is that if you're going to ask them to pick something at random, there should be a good reason for that. And this is one of the problems I have with those think dots. I talk about them in the choice options, but I'm not sure they're really my favorite because I'm not sure I really like the randomness of it. I understand how it might be fun for students and engaging, but for example, on this one, I think you might actually encourage critical thinking to a greater extent if you made it unrandom, if you had the students deliberately choose which topic they thought would have the biggest impact on their community. So the idea was, in this activity, the students will select 3 topic cards at random and discuss why it affects biodiversity and what to do about it. And then they did some research. But I thought it would be so cool. I love this list. It's a fantastic list. But I thought it would be really cool if the students actually looked at the list and made purposeful decisions. Like, which one of these things is actually going to have the largest influence on biodiversity in this specific place? And if you wanted to add some interesting conversations, you could say, well, what would it be like? Would it be the same thing for people in another city? Like if they lived in Denmark, would it look the same? Or if they lived in Muncie versus Indianapolis versus Chicago, which of these topics are most important for, say, our community, for, say, this other community? So I love this activity. I was just thinking, to make it more purposeful, maybe the students could actually make an argument why they chose which topic. And then here they used the squirrel site. So there's another type of site that I thought was cool. And then they got to do some research, and I was thinking it might be cool if, even if it wasn't in this unit, that they designed their own study to, so say for example they picked using water effectively or wisely, and then they actually made that their campaign. But before they try to increase it, they try to get a baseline data and then introduce an intervention and then see what happens. And so that really integrates this idea of scientific research into this biodiversity unit. So I thought that might be a cool idea. Anyways, they did a great job, and that's the feedback for Team 2. Here's Team Three's work, and they, of course, are working on the families. They're our primary grade teachers here, and I just noted the idea of enduring understandings or essential questions. I just knocked over a bottle of water. That might be possible here. And then they have such cool ideas in this little chart here. They did a great job planning out all 15 days. They did such a neat little activity where the students got to share their traditions. But this is what I really wanted to highlight on their paper for everyone. So when you are developing your lessons for your full unit, one of the rubric elements talks about incorporating different types of elements. For example, critical thinking, creative thinking, greater complexity than grade level. And one thing I've always struggled with is really being able to categorize your work in this rubric. So it really highlights the challenges of developing rubrics, in my opinion. But in any event, what was super helpful for me is that they did this for me. So they said in lessons 1, 2, 3, 6, and 8, that's when we're addressing critical thinking. In lessons 3, 4, and 10, that's when we're doing enrichment. We don't have any examples of constructivist learning, and that's fine. You only needed, I think, 7 or 8. Check the rubric. But this is really helpful for me to be able to tell where you were thinking, so that way I can look at lesson 3 and say, oh yeah, lesson 3 does have examples of creative thinking, or at least I see those questions that they're asking are examples that is going to promote student creative thinking. So really think about that. I love how they did that. If you could do that for your own individual units, that would be fabulous. That would really help me to see what you were thinking, because sometimes I can make a case for something, but I'm not sure if that's what you meant for it to be, and I try to give you the benefit of the doubt, but then sometimes I can make connections where there aren't any connections. So that's really helpful. I really like how they did that. Then they had a good lesson, who's my family, but the part that I would ask for them to consider is making sure that it's tiered and differentiated. So I know you are good lesson writers and planners. The goal of the course is to make sure that your lessons address the needs of your high ability learners. And so when you write a lesson in this course, you should be considering, okay, now how can I take this up a notch? How can I make sure and reach the needs of my high ability students? What would this look like for my on-level students? What would this look like for my high ability students? So just consider that. They had a great grading rubric, and to be honest, it looked really cool on their site, but when I downloaded it into Word, it didn't translate quite as cool or quite as well. But they use student language in their rubric. Like, students could read their rubric and understand what they were looking for, and then they could see that this is a super smiley face, a star, a check, or a frowny face. And that's kind of idea that, this level of student could really grasp. And then they also had a peer evaluation, which I thought was another great addition. And finally, for Team 4, what I would suggest is there needs to be the chart, the overview of your lessons. So when you're creating your individual units, you definitely need this chart. The chart is a key component on the rubric. It's a key component for organizing your entire unit. Then for your individual lesson, like I told another group, it just needs to be differentiated. That's the focus of the course. It needs to address the needs of your high ability learners. Not all lessons are going to be tiered. I think that I've covered that in detail before, but all lessons should at least include the higher level thinking questions, how you're going to meet the needs of your high ability students. So I do like how they ask the big question here, and this is something that I'm always coming back to. Where are your essential questions and enduring understandings, and are you representing that in your lessons, in your assessments, as everything being tied together? And here they did do a great job of asking, how did using metaphors and similes help the reader better understand the person we chose? So how did the use of this influence the reader? How did the author use this to influence the reader? And I think those are some of the big ideas from this unit. Also this week, I wanted to just highlight two really cool ideas that I saw from your personal units. This is from Erin's unit, and the thing that I thought was really helpful that might help other people is this is from her, it's a test item analysis of her pre-post assessment, and she is asking the students to think through this. So she's aligned each question number on her assessment to the standard, and then the students are going to look at if they got it correct, if they made just a simple mistake, if they didn't get it at all, if they guessed. And I think giving the students this kind of information and having them take an ownership role in their learning is really important, and it's a really great table. And I think sometimes in math, students don't even think about why they got something wrong. They just look at their total grade or they got this wrong, but this really helps them to become more reflective on their practice as mathematicians, and they can assess whether it was a simple mistake or something they just didn't understand. And really you could make this as detailed or as less detailed as you would like. And then she asked them, what are the concepts you still do not understand? And one thing I was thinking was that this might be a great way to even prepare for the final test. So, if you find that some of these topics no one in your class knows on the pre-assessment, it might not be helpful for them to fill out this test item analysis at that point. But if you go through the unit and then at some point you do this, then they can start to consider what they got, what they didn't get, what kind of mistakes they're making. One of the things that I've been really considering is just how students are not always metacognitively aware of what's happening. So just because what the teacher is saying makes sense to them doesn't mean they learned it. And so this type of analysis is perfect to promote metacognition. And so you could take and adjust this in different fields and different topics, but I really liked how Erin did this. And then Roderick shared, in his unit, I hope neither of them mind me sharing this. I didn't really ask for permission first, but since they were both really cool ideas, I thought I would share. This is just a brief way of addressing one of the graphic organizers that we have talked about in the past, but I liked how he reorganized it to include how the student is feeling. So once again, this is addressing the metacognition, like thinking about how, making the students reflect upon what they need to know. And so they can decide how they're feeling about the topic. They have to use appropriate vocabulary, important words. These are the big ideas. And I read an article recently about taking 30 seconds after you listen to a lecture or go to a talk to really pick out the big ideas and how much of a difference it makes, rather than having 20 pages of notes from the lecture, having a 30-second paragraph on the big ideas. And I did that during this last week for all the sessions that I went to, and it really did make a very big difference for me. And now I can look back and I prefer to look at my 30-second understandings rather than I did actually take 23 pages of notes. But I think that 30-second understandings will be more helpful, and I like how Roderick incorporated that into this graphic organizer. And then he still has the I wonder, which I think promotes intellectual curiosity, and I'm still confused about. So I just liked how I'm sorry I can't fit it all in the screen in the same shot, but I liked how he included all 4 of these pieces plus the feeling piece. So I thought that was cool. Now I wanted to talk just briefly about a few of the discussion points that you brought up in the last discussion. From Catherine, she wrote, I find it inspiring that's all you do, because Ryan talked about how he used differentiation all the time, and he has a very good grasp on differentiation and how to use it in the classroom. But she wrote, sometimes I get overwhelmed when I start to use something like differentiated instruction or tiered instruction, not because the concept itself is challenging or I don't see the purpose, because I start to think, yikes, 150 kids. And I think this comment right here is probably the one I really wanted to highlight. How do I meet all their needs? And I just want to remind everyone of a couple things. One, I'm hoping that this class really stretches you in some way. whether it's you haven't really thought about enduring understandings, or whether maybe you haven't incorporated this piece of technology, or whether it's you haven't differentiated something. So this is, so I'm hoping that it causes you to be stretched. But on the other hand, I don't want you to feel stressed out. So there's a very fine line, and I realize that this class is probably bordering on that fine line. But what I want you to consider is it's important to experiment. I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen? You mess up a lesson. You get up the next day, you try it again. I'm not saying change your entire classroom around for this. I'm saying give it a shot. Try it out one day. Do an experiment, see how it goes. But then for the one, so that was my little pep talk, like, don't worry, experiment. But then the other thing is 150 kids, and I think Tomlinson does a nice job in the chapter that I think I gave you on what differentiation is and what it isn't, and it's not individualized instruction. So the best suggestion that I have here for 150 kids is you're not trying to meet all their needs. What you're, well, that came across wrong. You are trying to meet their needs, yes. But what you're trying to do is group them so that you can meet their needs more effectively and efficiently. And so that might mean that you have a group of 10, 10, 10. So rather than thinking about all 150, which 150 kids, it's just a huge number, and I understand how overwhelming that is. But if you could think of it in each class as having 2 or 3 groups instead of 30 students, I think that might make it a little bit more manageable, even if you just started out by having 2 groups, you know, students who have a grasp on the concepts and students who do not. Just thinking about it that way I think might be a little helpful. Don't try to have, I'm going to talk about multiple intelligences in a minute, but don't try to have 8 different groups doing 8 different things. That's not a good way to get started. Have 2 groups, and don't be afraid to start really small. And Catherine had another great post later about how it's important to be able to think, organize, and collaborate, which is a different type of basic skill. So those are the skills that employers are really looking for these days, and those are the things that I think we can really foster in a variety of ways. Then this is the big component. I think this is the great discussion or debate of the whole discussion board this week. Roderick wrote, I'm not a big person for learning styles or multiple intelligences, and I dismiss it philosophic tier to a construct I dismiss philosophically and neurologically. Now, I would hate to store up another hornet's nest. Well, go ahead. Why not, right? This is a graduate level course. We're supposed to talk about controversial topics sometimes, so I'm glad he brought it up. And I have read some of the research that suggests that multiple intelligences is not really a defensible construct as is. And I think we could all say that we would prefer to do something one way over another way. But then how it's not always applicable to a variety of, the articles that I've read talk about how it's not always applicable to a specific content area. So for example, in geography, does it really make sense to make up a song about using latitude and longitude rather than using your visual spatial skills to actually work with a map? No. So I think that research-wise and perhaps philosophically and perhaps even neurologically, I am not a neuroscientist. I am not really prepared to go into that discussion. But what I am prepared to do is say that I do think that students may enjoy learning a topic in a variety of ways. I prefer Sternberg's intelligences. I like 3. I like things that are a little more simple and a little more streamlined. The multiple intelligences are too numerous for me to really do a good job with, and I've never really found a good example of a way you can tier something 8 ways, and really I don't even consider that tiering. I would consider that differentiating, but that's a different conversation as well. So I would say that I do see how students might choose to learn something in one way or the other, but there's not always that option. So just like I suggested with the map, like sometimes it just makes more sense to do it one way or the other way. No one is going to learn how to find a location on a map by singing a song about it. I mean, it's a very visual task. But I don't see anything wrong with trying to engage students in a variety of ways. So if it's possible to engage them through a song versus through a visual presentation, I don't, while the constructs may not be completely defensible in terms of different intelligences, like I think they might still have some sort of practical validity in terms of how to engage students. And that's all I really want to say about that, I guess. But I do encourage you to think about Sternberg's intelligences, because I do think some people prefer to take a more practical approach to problems. Some people might like to analyze them, and some people might like to be more creative in their approach. And there's only 3 of them. And while I still think, there might be this general intelligence level that manifests itself in all 3 of these factors, I still think that it has practical validity in terms of engaging and motivating students. But that's not all that's included in the learning profile. So learning profiles also include whether or not they like to work with other people, whether or not they can work with music, or they prefer working with music. So there's a couple other things to also consider in terms of differentiation in learning profiles. But I'm really glad he brought it up, because it is actually a controversial topic in the field, and the construct validity has not really been established. Then the other big concept that was discussed from Jamie was, how do we differentiate at the elementary level and use those grades in electronic grading systems? And there was a great discussion over that and which electronic systems you use, and I really appreciated that. And I think I've talked about my opinion on grades before in a variety of locations. But my thought is to grade, at the bare minimum, I feel like you could have 2 grades. Now, whether or not you average those 2 grades together, which doesn't make any sense at all because you lose the nuance that those 2 grades represent. But if you have to have 1 grade, I feel like it's better to have at least 2 pieces that you're putting in. It doesn't make any sense to average them, but that's not the point right now. The point is that you should have at least 1 grade that addresses the grade level expectations. And that way you can see, did your students meet that grade level expectation? And so if they pre-test and they get out of an entire unit on math, then they automatically get an A right there for that grade level expectation grade. They passed it. I mean, that's the bottom line. There's a second grade, though, on something like intellectual effort, intellectual contribution, something like that, where all their replacement assignments are placed. And so you still understand they have met this standard grade level expectation, but then I've also seen that they're developing and putting in a lot of effort and work into developing themselves as a scholar or as a student. So I like the idea of those 2 different grades, and that way you have both of those areas covered. But the averaging of it really bothers me, because why would you want to average an effort, intellectual, challenge grade versus the grade level competency grade? It doesn't make any sense to average, but I know in math you have 1 grade, so what are you going to do? You're going to put them together. Anyways, that's my big suggestion on that. I prefer 2 grades. Ariel talked about, and I really love this, is she comes back to the idea of purposefulness. And I think that's what we always have to come back to. What is the purpose of this? So does this do something beneficial for our students? Does it help them learn? Is it beneficial for our educational practices in general? And I think that's a really important point to always revisit. And then Allison, I think, had a really great point close to the end of the discussion board about how the tiered lesson plan for her is difficult because they're required to write a research paper. And I think this brings up a really good point, because when we talk about tiered lessons, you have to first think about what are you going to hold constant and what are you going to vary. And so by holding the product constant, which would be the research paper, it does free you up to vary other things like the process. So is she going to ask different students to connect more of the literature that's written at deeper levels, literature for people in the field versus literature that's written at a different lexile level for perhaps more interdisciplinary people. So there's a lot you can do, but by knowing she needs to hold the research paper constant, it gives her actually more freedom in what she can vary. So I think, and she talks about that, but I thought that was a really insightful comment also. So that concludes week 3's feedback video, and I look forward to receiving your week 4 work. So I hope this was helpful. Please email me if you have any questions.